On September 16, 1985, Steve Jobs walked out of Apple, the company he had built, the company that carried his name, his vision, his identity. He was 30 years old, worth millions, and completely out of power. Just months earlier, he had been the golden boy of Silicon Valley, the face of a revolution, the man who promised to put a computer in every home. Now, he was gone. The fall took weeks. The rise took a lifetime. Stephen Paul Jobs was born in 1955 in San Francisco, California, but he wasn't born into the world he would later dominate.
He was adopted. His biological parents, both graduate students, gave him up shortly after birth. He was taken in by Paul and Clara Jobs, a working-class couple in Mountain View. No money, no connections, just a small house in what would later become Silicon Valley. His father was a machinist, a man who worked with his hands, fixing engines, building things, taking them apart just to understand how they worked.
Steve watched, and then he started doing it himself. He wasn't an easy child. Rebellious, intense, restless. Teachers described him as brilliant, but difficult. He didn't follow rules. He questioned everything. But when it came to electronics, something clicked. In the garage, beside his father, Steve learned how to build. Not just how things worked, but how they could be made better, cleaner, simpler. He became obsessed with design. Not just function, but beauty. By his teenage years, he was already spending time with engineers, walking into places like Hewlett-Packard, asking questions most adults wouldn't dare to ask. And somehow, they listened. Because even then, Steve Jobs had something rare, a way of seeing the future before anyone else could. But vision alone wasn't enough. He needed someone who could build it. In 1971, he met a quiet, shy engineer named Steve Wozniak, and together, they were about to start something far bigger than either of them imagined. In 1976, inside a small suburban garage in Los Altos, California, Apple was born. Not in a lab, not in a corporate office, a garage. Two Steves, one vision, and one machine. Steve Wozniak built the computer. He was the engineer, the genius behind the circuits. Steve Jobs saw something else, a product. Not just for hobbyists, not just for engineers, but for everyone.
At the time, computers were intimidating. Huge machines, sold as kits, requiring technical knowledge just to turn on. Jobs wanted to change that. So they built the Apple I, a simple board, fully assembled, no complicated setup. It wasn't perfect, but it was different, and different was enough. They sold their first batch to a local computer shop, 50 units. It was small, but it was real. Apple was no longer an idea. It was a company. Then came the Apple II. This one changed everything. Color graphics, a plastic case, a machine that looked approachable. Jobs insisted on it. He pushed for design, for simplicity, for something people would actually want in their homes. Wozniak built the technology. Jobs built the vision around it, and it worked. The Apple II became one of the first mass-produced personal computers. Sales exploded. Within a few years, Apple wasn't a garage startup anymore. It was a rising force. By 1980, Apple went public. The IPO made Jobs worth over $200 million at just 25 years old. He was now one of the youngest self-made millionaires in America. The media loved him. The young visionary, the rebel who challenged IBM, the man who believed computers could change the world. But behind the image was a different reality. Jobs was demanding, obsessive, relentless. He pushed employees to their limits, expected perfection. Some called him brilliant, others impossible. And inside Apple, tensions were growing.
Because Steve Jobs didn't just want to build computers anymore. He wanted to build something revolutionary, something that would change everything again: the Macintosh. In January 1984, Steve Jobs stood backstage moments before a launch that would define his career. The room was packed. Media, engineers, executives, everyone was watching. Then the screen lit up. A commercial unlike anything seen before. A dystopian world. A hammer thrown through conformity. Apple wasn't just selling a computer, it was declaring war on IBM, on the old way of thinking. And then the Macintosh appeared. Small, friendly, a computer with a mouse, a graphical interface, icons, windows. It felt human. Jobs smiled. This wasn't just a product, it was his vision made real. But behind the scenes, the reality was different. The Macintosh team had been pushed to the edge. Jobs demanded perfection. Not good enough, not close, perfect. He obsessed over details no one else cared about. The shape of the case, the sound it made when it turned on. He wanted beauty, inside and out. But perfection came at a cost. Deadlines slipped, budgets grew, and Jobs pushed harder. He could inspire people, but he could also break them. Engineers quit. Executives clashed with him. Inside Apple, frustration was building. The Macintosh launched to massive attention, but sales didn't match the hype. It was expensive, limited, not the instant revolution Jobs had promised. And now the board was watching closely. Jobs' behavior, once tolerated, was becoming a problem. He dismissed colleagues, ignored authority. He believed he was always right. And for years, that belief had worked. But Apple was no longer a small company. It was a corporation with investors, with structure, with people who could challenge him. In 1983, Apple had hired a new CEO, John Sculley, experienced, corporate, controlled.
At first, Jobs saw him as an ally, but alliances don't last when power is involved. Tensions grew. Meetings turned into arguments. Arguments turned into battles. Inside Apple, lines were being drawn. And slowly, quietly, the company Steve Jobs built was beginning to turn against him. In 1985, the battle for Apple reached its breaking point. It wasn't loud, it wasn't public, but inside the company, it was war. Steve Jobs versus the board. Vision versus control. At the center of it all, John Sculley, the CEO Jobs himself had recruited, the man he once trusted, now his biggest opponent. Tensions had been building for months. The Macintosh wasn't performing as expected. Revenue was slowing, and Jobs was becoming harder to manage. He challenged decisions, ignored structure, pushed beyond limits. To him, Apple was his creation. To the board, it was a business. Jobs made his move first. He tried to take control, planned to push Sculley out. But Sculley found out, and instead of stepping aside, he fought back. A board meeting was called. Quiet, closed doors. But the outcome would change everything. Sculley presented his case. Jobs was brilliant, but unstable. Visionary, but destructive. The company needed stability, not chaos. The board listened, and then they chose. Not Jobs. Just like that, he was stripped of power, removed from the Macintosh division, pushed into a role with no real influence, a figurehead in the company he built. Steve Jobs was 30 years old and suddenly irrelevant. The humiliation was quiet but complete. No dramatic firing, no public statement, just silence. Inside Apple, everyone knew. Outside, the story spread slowly. The golden boy had lost. Jobs tried to stay, tried to find purpose. But there was none, no control, no future. So he made a decision. He left. After nearly a decade, Steve Jobs walked away from Apple. The company he started in a garage. The company that made him who he was, gone. For the first time in years, he had nothing. No team, no product, no power. Just an idea that he could start again. Because if there was one thing Steve Jobs believed, it was this: he wasn't finished. In 1985, Steve Jobs was out of Apple. No title, no control, no company. For most people, that would have been the end. For Jobs, it was a reset. Just months after leaving, he started again. A new company, Next. It wasn't built for the masses. It was built for the future. High-end computers designed for universities and researchers. Black magnesium cubes. Minimalist. Perfect. Beautiful. But expensive. Too expensive. Next impressed engineers, but failed commercially. Sales were low, losses grew. Once again, Jobs had built something brilliant that the market didn't fully understand. But Next wasn't his only move. In 1986, Jobs made a quiet investment, $5 million, into a small graphics division being spun off from Lucasfilm. It had no clear direction, no proven business model, just technology and potential. He called it Pixar. At first, it struggled. They tried selling hardware, failed. Tried software, failed again. But then something shifted. Animation, short films, storytelling through computers. It was new, different, and slowly it started working. In 1995, Pixar released Toy Story, the first fully computer-animated feature film in history. It was a risk, but it became a phenomenon. Box office success, critical acclaim. Pixar went public, and overnight, Steve Jobs was a billionaire again. But this time, not for computers, for storytelling. Meanwhile, Apple was struggling. Without Jobs, the company lost direction. Too many products, too little focus. Innovation slowed. Sales declined. By the mid-90s, Apple was close to collapse. The company that once defined the future was now trying to survive it.
In 1996, Apple made a decision. Desperate but necessary. They bought Next for $429 million. Not for the computers, for the software, and for the man behind it. Steve Jobs was coming back. At first, just an advisor, then interim CEO, and then in full control. The same company that pushed him out now needed him to survive. He returned, older, sharper, different. The question wasn't whether he could lead again. The question was, could he save Apple? Because what came next would become the greatest comeback in tech history.
In 1997, Apple was weeks away from collapse. The company was losing money, products were failing, and the man they once forced out was now in charge again. Steve Jobs didn't ease into it. He cut everything. Dozens of products gone. Projects canceled. Teams reduced. Focus. That was his rule. One vision, one direction. And in 1998, it began. The iMac. Bright colors, transparent design. A computer that didn't look like a machine, but something alive. It wasn't just technology, it was personality. And it sold. Millions of units. Apple was back. Then came the iPod. 1,000 songs in your pocket. Simple, elegant, revolutionary. It didn't just change Apple, it changed music. How people bought it, how they carried it, how they experienced it. And Jobs was just getting started. In 2007, he walked onto a stage. Black turtleneck, jeans, calm, controlled. He held up a device, an iPod, a phone, an internet communicator. 3 products, or so it seemed. Then he said it. It's one device, the iPhone. Everything changed. Phones became computers. Apps became industries. Apple became unstoppable. By the end of the decade, it was no longer just a tech company. It was the most valuable company in the world. And Steve Jobs was at the center of it all. But behind the success, nothing had really changed. Jobs was still demanding, still intense. He pushed people harder than anyone else. Some called it genius, others cruelty. He could inspire greatness, but at a cost. And that cost followed him his entire life. In 2003, he was diagnosed with cancer, pancreatic, rare. At first, he kept it private, worked through it, ignored it. But over time, it became impossible to hide. He grew thinner, weaker, yet he stayed on stage, kept presenting, kept building, as if time didn't matter. On October 5th, 2011, Steve Jobs died. He was 56 years old. The world stopped. Tributes poured in from competitors, from presidents, from millions of people. Holding devices he helped create, Apple continued, stronger than ever. Trillions in value, products in every home. The empire survived, but the man was gone. And his legacy was never simple. He was a visionary, a perfectionist, a builder of the future, but also difficult, relentless, sometimes impossible. Both truths exist at the same time, because Steve Jobs didn't just build products, he changed how the world thinks.